If someone ever tells you that they definitively understand or know the true purpose of the Nazca Lines, I am giving you the permission to ignore them because they're definitively wrong. People have been trying to explain the purpose and function of the Nazca Lines for nearly 100 years now, and still no one has figured it out. And as I've been researching the Nazca Lines, I realized something about them that I don't think I've ever seen acknowledged before. I think that the Nazca Lines are the very first time in ancient history that we see ancient people breaking reality. They transcend beyond the horizon of the natural world. And what I mean by this is you can build giant pyramids that boggle the mind as to how you've done this. You can erect megalithic stone heads like the Olmec heads, and you look at the size of it and the distance with which it has traveled, and it just boggles your mind. But yet you can still comprehend the size of the monuments, the size of the scale of ancient buildings. No matter from where you stand, you can comprehend the size of these things. The Nazca Lines may be the first and maybe the only example in all of the ancient world where no matter where you stand, no matter what strategic position you put yourself in, it is not possible to comprehend the size of the Nazca Lines. And this is what I mean by this may be the first and only example of a radical transformation in which ancient people are perceiving their natural world. If the Nazca people didn't invent flight to perceive or see these lines from the sky, which I think is probably unlikely, then what this means is that the Nazca Lines can only be perceived intellectually. They can only be perceived through the mind. So the Nazca people are breaking reality. They are transcending again beyond the horizon of nature. And I find that fascinating. So if I'm not marching through a jungle searching for an ancient lost city or stepping through the desert looking for lost ancient temples, I'm usually searching for a good historical show or documentary. But unfortunately, there are so many shows like The Pyramid Code, The Story of Egypt, Time Team, Caligula, In Search of the Trojan War, and so many others that are only available outside the US. And that's why I partnered with today's sponsor, Surfshark. With Surfshark, I'm not limited to only watching shows and documentaries that are available within my region. In a few simple clicks, I'm connected to my region of choice and watching anything I want access to. And I honestly had no idea just how much I was missing out on before I started using Surfshark VPN. And with using the code Caverns, you can receive an extra 4 months for free, as well as a 30-day money-back guarantee. And you can join me in watching historical shows and documentaries that you probably never had access to before. And believe me, there's a lot of them. Click the link in the description below or somewhere on screen and use the code Caverns, that's all caps CAVERNS, for an extra 4 months free with Surfshark VPN. Now, back to the show. Okay, so the Nazca culture. We don't know exactly when it begins. It probably starts sometime around 500 to 400 BC, but their pottery really gets amped up sometime around 100 BC. Now, when you mention the Nazca, most people are going to think of the Nazca Lines, the thing that makes them famous, this enigmatic mystery that is unlike anything else around the ancient world. But one of the things that I love about the Nazca, which is probably my nerdy anthropology side coming out, is Nazca pottery. It is so colorful, so vibrant, so well preserved. The colors just pop out at you. You have these really vibrant reds and blues and whites and greens and yellows, and they have these wonderful depictions of the Nazca mythology, the Nazca pantheons. You have feline gods, you have snake-headed gods, you have gods who cut the heads off of people and carry them around and fly in the sky. It's a beautiful style. And I've actually been looking around for Nazca style decor to put around my house, and for some reason it just doesn't exist. And when I look at Nazca pottery and Nazca art, I always wonder, we have evidence of this art beginning sometime around 100 BC, and it's really ramping up after that point. But the art style is so perfect, and it's so beautiful and so unique to the Nazca people, and yet iconic and just perfect. There's nothing wrong with it. And I wonder, how many generations, how many centuries or millennia does it take for a culture to get to the point where their artisans have developed their own iconic style that even 2,000 years later, I look at and I'm like, man, that's beautiful. I want to put that in my house. It takes a long time to get to that point. And I just wonder how much lost history there is just behind these artisans. This is something I think about all over the ancient world. So the Nazca people begin sometime around 500 to 400 BC, and they continue to about 400 AD. And then they essentially evolve or dissolve into the greater Andean culture as the Indian world begins to become more unified, which leads into the unification of the Wari Empire and the unification of the later Inca Empire as well. Now, one thing that you may not have known, but it may not necessarily surprise you, is that the two, at least what I consider the weirdest cultures in ancient Peru, which I think is the place where the most strange and bizarre ancient cultures in the ancient world are all packed in together in Peru. But the Paracas people and the Nazca people, we've gone over why the Nazca are so strange, but the Paracas people, these lived on the Paracas Peninsula on the coast of Peru. And they're famous not because of any structures that they built, not because of any large towns that they built, but because of their burials, their textiles, their iconic art, and from their giant elongated skulls. They practice skull elongation, and we don't know exactly why they did this. We don't know where the precipice of this comes from. There are some explanations out there that I think are kind of silly and not nearly significant enough. But at some point, the Paracas culture leaves this Peruvian coast. They go down onto the southern Peruvian coast into the Nazca Valley, where the Nazca Lines are later going to be carved into the ground, and they evolve into the Nazca culture. Now, when they start doing this, sometime around 500 to 400 BC and leading up into around the year 0, the Nazca develop something that's going to be very important later on in Andean society, and in some places had already been important, which is urbanization. We see the development of what we used to think was the Nazca capital called Cahuachi. And it's about 40 different mound sites with 2 major large pyramids. And what these pyramids are essentially just modified mounds where you have these adobe hand-laid brick structures that are all laid together, and these are labyrinths of rooms. Now, there's an anomaly here that's pretty similar to, let's say, Machu Picchu. For a long time, we thought that maybe Machu Picchu was this big, bustling city, and later on, archaeological evidence actually shows that there really weren't that many people living there year-round. What Cahuachi may have been is something more like a Mecca site or a pilgrimage site, where people who lived in the same way that the Paracas culture did, let's say 1,000 years before, where they live in very, very small towns, just little small villages. Some are made out of stone, but most are made out of wood with thatch roofs. These little small villages scattered around the Nazca Valley, probably next to streams and rivers that head out into the Pacific Ocean, they would all meet at certain times of the year at the Mecca center of Cahuachi. And the reason that we don't think that there were a bunch of people living here year-round is because we just don't find that many artifacts at Cahuachi. Now, this may be because of looting, or it may just be because there really weren't that many people living there. So what the idea is that probably, from my point of view, what I've seen traveling around the ancient Americas is that typically traditional cities are very, very rare. Traditional cities with actual stone buildings are very rare. Most of the time, it's an inner sanctum with the most important people of that culture. Now, we don't have evidence for kings in the Nazca culture, and maybe kings didn't exist at all. What it may have been more similar to are sacred priests, people who understand the stars and can make astronomical predictions about the seasons. Usually these people develop power and they become important because they understand the sacred knowledge of the world, and through this person that acts as an oracle between the natural world and the divine or the heavens, this person needs to be taken care of, they need to be exalted, and so usually they're at the center of the civilization. I say all that to say Cahuachi was probably a temple center. It was probably an astronomical observatory. It was probably where the priests and the astronomers lived. And, I don't know if it was annual. I don't know if it was multiple times a year. It probably was. Everyone would come in from around the Nazca Valley, migrate to Kawachi, and they would have some kind of festival, some kind of thing that brought them all together periodically. It was officially found by William Farabee in 1922. And Farabee actually said that he saw evidence of looting and that he thinks that quote-unquote mercenaries, which are just looters, had already sold all of the Nazca treasures of Kawachi to museums and collectors all around the world, and that all of the important artifacts basically had already disappeared. Now, in the last 100 years, some Nazca artifacts seem to have just appeared out of nowhere, almost as though the black market artifact trade has been booming for hundreds of years now. So the Russians are heavily involved in this as well. The Mexico is heavily involved in this. And so sometimes ancient artifacts just appear out of nowhere, but we haven't seen this massive influx of Nazca treasures appearing anywhere. And I'm not saying that I doubt Farabee. I actually believe him if he saw major amounts of looting at Kawachi. I just think that these are probably in private collections around the world and will likely never see the light of day. And I've always thought that there should be some kind of anonymous website where people can at least send photos of the things that they own anonymously in private collections, so that people like me could look at them and study them and know that they exist, because there could be something on a piece of pottery or like a golden artifact. There could be a golden idol that's found that confirms something we've wondered for a century or so, that's just sitting in some trillionaire's basement museum. There's another site that's nearby Kawachi called Estaqueria, and it's definitely residential based on the artifact record that was found in the ground around there, which is basically broken pots and little bits of burnt ground where it looks like there were kitchens or there were fires where food was being made. But this is a small urban area where we find the outlines of the foundations of stone homes, and they have these wooden stakes that are still sitting out of the ground nearly 2,000 years or maybe more than 2,000 years later. And for a long time they thought what these stakes were, but they were probably the corners of buildings where you have these wooden stakes that would have wooden lintel beams going across and thatched triangular roofs hanging over them. That's a pretty iconic building style for all of the pre-Columbian Americas. And these little villages are probably where the Nazca people, the main people, your farmers and your fishermen, were living, while the priests, the people who hold and covet this sacred knowledge, got to live in the big palaces that are at the center of the civilization that everyone eventually migrates to. And this is actually why I think that, let's say, in the Maya world, the Maya world, which is not in South America, it is in Mexico and Central America, what we call Mesoamerica in pre-Columbian terms. This is why I think that the priesthood was eventually corrupted and was turned into divine kingship, because you would have these cults of people who are studying the stars, they're studying the moon and the sun. What they realize is that there is a cycle to the sky, and that by studying these cycles, you can actually predict things in the future. And the more you're able to predict astronomical events, the more you're able to have a control or a mastery of your natural world, and the more it essentially elevates you as an individual. And so I think that these started out as priests who are carrying out these rituals to keep the cosmic wheels turning in the sky, the proverbial cosmic wheel. And eventually, they needed to be propped up. You need these people who are constantly studying the stars. So you need people who are employed to bring them food. You need people who are employed to keep them comfortable. Medicine begins to be created to keep these priests alive. And the priests inherently at some point realize that this sacred knowledge elevates them and puts a wall or a distinction between them and everyone else. And so they become powerful. And eventually all of this knowledge somehow culminates in a single person. Or the priesthood eventually turns into a family. That may be another possibility. It turns into a family and eventually culminates in one divine center of that family, perhaps the biggest personality, the strongest person. And that eventually, through natural processes, becomes a divine God king who is divinely connected to the heavenly realm. I think that's how kingship forms. I think it forms through the shamanic world and through religious practices. And so I think that we were at least seeing the first chapter, the first stages of that in the Nazca world. But we see that entire transition or that evolution of civilization all throughout the pre-Columbian Americas. So getting to the Nazca Lines, they were actually discovered by a Peruvian archaeologist named Toribio Zespi while he was hiking through the Nazca Valley. And he was probably, it doesn't say explicitly, but there are small mountains around the valley where you can sort of get a viewpoint to see some of the smaller lines, or at the very least you can see one end of the line running off into the distance. And so it's likely that the indigenous locals are the direct descendants of the Nazca people themselves, and that these lines had always been known about since the beginning of time, but this was the first official Peruvian archaeologist to actually go down there and give them a look-see. So he probably goes up on one of the hillsides and documents them. Now, this is the early 1920s, but they're later fully realized in the early 1930s when commercial planes began flying over them, and then small privately owned planes were flying over them and photographing them. And these are some of the most iconic images found anywhere in the Nazca realm. These black and white images, these crisp black and white images of the Nazca Lines. The actual process of how they were made is not that complicated in a physical sense. Essentially what they're doing is they are taking the stones that are on the ground and clearing them away, because the bedrock that lies underneath contains stones that are not as heavily eroded and weathered, so you have this white color that appears underneath. So if you can kind of, in a way, sweep the lines, or you can sweep the desert floor, sweep the stones away, and it reveals this white line from underneath. Now, the planning, the math and the geometry behind how the lines are organized and how they stay perfectly straight, and how they're able to make very complicated images like the monkey, the spider, the hummingbird, the condor, or even the people that you see. I don't know exactly how you do that. It must have been extremely complicated, having not been able to see it from the sky. And so from the 1930s, there's been a countless amount of theories on what the Nazca Lines were used for, what they mean, what information about the ancient world we can glean from studying them, and what their purpose was. Were they being used by the Nazca people, or were they just symbolic of something? They were created in the ground and never visited again. Well, we don't think that that's true, because we have found evidence of Nazca people continuously visiting the lines throughout the ancient world. We can see where people are perhaps on purpose shattering pottery on the lines, and there's organic material inside the pottery that can be carbon dated, and we find multiple piles of it that come from different centuries all in the same area. So the Nazca people are continuously visiting these lines, and it looks like that they're continuously maintaining them, like they have, people going out and sweeping the lines to keep them visible, which is really interesting. Visible for what? Visible for who? For the people walking it? I don't know. Now, one of the theories is that they are sacred paths related to cemeteries and aqueducts that are possibly carved into the ground above sacred burial grounds, while also pointing toward aqueducts or bodies of water that are somewhere off in the distance. They've also been proposed to be ritual sites or enclosures for ancestor worship. And ancestor worship, like I've said, maybe it was in the last video, is pretty wide throughout all of the pre-Columbian Americas. It's almost a universal thing. I think it is a universal thing. In some places, we don't have evidence for actual gods, like in the Olmec world. There's not really definitive evidence for gods per se, but the presence of the worship of ancestors is basically a universal reality across all of the pre-Columbian Americas. So if there's a big mystery about something that pre-Columbian Americans are doing, if you say it probably has something to do with their ancestors, well, that's probably at least in part correct, because they were all obsessed with ancestor worship. Another idea, which I think I sort of agree with in some kind of way, is that they're an astronomical clock of sorts, but this can mean a plethora of different things. It's said that they may have been lines pointing towards astronomical bodies in the night sky, or maybe in the daytime sky, and the geoglyphs representing constellations that the Nazca identified. So it would be like if today we carved constellations of the Big Dipper, the Little Dipper, Leo, Draco into the desert sand, we would be printing the constellations that we identify onto the desert sand. I don't think that this is really a bad explanation, because when I'm looking in the night sky, sometimes I think I see the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper in every constellation. So there's probably an infinite number of combinations of stars that you could turn into some kind of image, some kind of identifiable constellation. So I don't think it's crazy to think that the actual images, rather than the lines and the trapezoidal formations and the triangles that we see, I think the images that we see are probably constellations. Another idea is that these are guidelines that point towards other cities, sacred mountains, caves, or other large sources of water. But I don't buy this at all. I have read a paper. I read an entire section of a book on the lines yesterday, but in relation to the Nazca, that said that they were pointing towards the local sacred mountain, which is Cerro Blanco. And I looked on Google Earth, where you can kind of flatten your perspective. There are almost no lines that point directly to this mountain, which is the largest mountain that sits just above the Nazca Valley. And pre-Columbian Americas, it's not like they started figuring out their geography and the lay of their land around, let's call it 500 BC in the year 0. They had it figured out for thousands of years before that. We know that that's the reality. So they didn't need a guideline that says, okay, so we're here today and we want to be in Lima, so we need to follow this line just to find Lima. No, they had all of that figured out thousands of years beforehand. So they're definitely not guidelines that are pointing people towards certain locations just so that they can get there. That just makes no sense whatsoever. And then we have Eric von Daniken's idea that these are landing strips for spacecraft, totally ignoring the fact that aliens probably don't need landing strips. They probably have 0-point energy or something like that, and they could just raise up, sit in the middle of the air, hover, and go back down. They could probably land wherever they want to. Also, there's nothing in the Nazca archaeological record that makes us think that they were interacting with extraterrestrial beings. Now, I'm not an alien denier. I'm not saying that aliens never visited the ancient world and they didn't poke around with ancient people and mess with them. I don't know. But I definitely don't think that the Nazca Lines are landing strips for ancient spacecraft. I think that landing strips are only necessary for our very limited human technology, where we need 1,000 yards for a Boeing 747 to land and finally slow down and release all of its energy to be able to come to a stop. I don't think that aliens that are able to travel all the way across the universe really need to worry about something like that. I'm kind of just poking fun, but Eric von Daniken's theory on the Nazca Lines used to be a big deal long before I was born, so I thought it's worth mentioning. And then we have a guy called Jim Woodman, and he was an author, journalist, explorer in the 1970s, and this actually blew my mind. I think this is pretty interesting. It's kind of like a Kon-Tiki raw Thor Heyerdahl expedition here that I was completely unaware of. So Jim Woodman, after he had flown over the Nazca Lines in the 70s, it must have been a little prop plane, and he's looking down on them, he was absolutely convinced that there is no way that with the massive scale of the Nazca Lines and how they're completely imperceivable from any position that you're standing in the Nazca Valley, even if you try to get up on the mountaintop, you can barely see or comprehend the lines that you're looking at. You can only see a portion of them as they just disappear off into the horizon. And so he's looking at the incomprehensible scale of these things and how high you have to fly just to be able to see them. And he's like, there's no way that ancient people were not in the sky, that the ancient Nazca people were not in the sky looking down on these things, which is, I don't think that's a crazy thought. This is something that's breaking reality. The Nazca people, the creation, even to be able to conceive of making the lines. Think about this. You're breaking out of the prehistoric mindset where there are things in front of you and you can only interact with what's in front of you. They are now imagining and perceiving things and creating things that may only be able to be perceived in the mind. They're breaking out of nature. I'm just trying to help you comprehend this idea. They are breaking out of the fabric of reality. which is mind-blowing. When I realized that, when I thought about that, I was like, whoa, I don't think that there's anything else like this. Even the pyramids in Egypt are nothing like the Nazca Lines. You can stand at the foot of the pyramids and you can look up and be like, wow, that's a giant pyramid. How did they get those stones up there? How did they make something this large? But you can comprehend it. I mean, no matter what position you're standing at on the Giza Plateau, you can look at the pyramids and be like, yeah, that's a giant pyramid, but it's right there. Imagine something so big that no matter where you're standing, it's still too big to see the whole thing, to comprehend it. That's what I'm saying. They're breaking out of the fabric of reality here, just trying to get that into our brain. And so he, like Thor Heyerdahl, how he would, Thor Heyerdahl would create these rafts that are consistent with the materials of the ancient culture that he was studying, whether it was Polynesians or whether it was the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Mesopotamians. This guy used naturally woven textiles using indigenous methods to create a hot air balloon, and he dug this hole in the ground nearby the Nazca Lines, and he burned a bunch of wood in the hole to fill up this essentially hot air balloon, and he had it like a little indigenous native raft that was connected to it. And sure enough, he flew over the Nazca Lines in this indigenously materially created hot air balloon. And while that's absolutely amazing, there just isn't, I mean, we just don't have any evidence of the fact that the Nazca people were able to make hot air balloons. Now, the method by which he did it was he created this little tunnel or chamber under the ground, and he burned a bunch of wood in it. Well, that leaves a lot of residue of burned wooden material, charcoal and soot inside that hole. And probably, it's not impossible, but probably we would have found burn marks somewhere around the Nazca Valley. And with the amount, I mean, there are thousands of these lines. If they're going up and checking the lines every time, there would probably be a plethora of evidence of something burning to be able to make the hot air balloon. That said, I often say this about Native Americans. We're not studying people who were anything like us. These were basically aliens. And they don't think like we do. They didn't perceive the world in the same way that we do. The way that they comprehend science and the material realm is so different and so foreign to us. That said, I sure would love to find the evidence for it. All right, so the latest theory on the usage and the purpose and the reason for the creation of the Nazca Lines, they've kind of dusted off an old theory that these are sacred walking paths, that by walking the path, walking this line, you would somehow conjure up the energy of the glyph or the image or the line that you're walking, and that it's described in a very vague way. Like sometimes when I read these academic papers, I feel like they are writing it in a way where they kind of want to have an answer, but they don't really have an answer. So it's written as though they know what it is, but it's some kind of vague thing where it's like, this is a cultural expression of the Nazca people onto the ground. And these are sacred walking paths that are walked to imbue the civilization with the energy of the geoglyph. It's something vague like that. And I just wish they were more blatant about the fact that they don't really know, that they don't really have a comprehensive understanding of these things, rather than some incredibly vague explanation that is kind of, I'm like rattling my brain at like, is there something wrong with me when I'm reading this? Why can I not comprehend what they're trying to say? I think it's because it just doesn't make sense. I think it's because the Nazca Lines in general make no sense. Well, why do they make no sense? Well, okay, so first off, I'm not going to say that walking the paths isn't what they were doing. They were definitely very active on the Nazca Lines. If you could walk around the Nazca Valley on the lines, you would find millions of pieces of pottery that are shattered on the ground, or maybe even full pieces of pottery. You'd probably find spear points and arrow points all around there. You would be able to tell that the Nazca people were walking all over these lines. So the idea that they're walking the lines is probably not wrong. but it's definitely an incomplete explanation as to what these are. They definitely are cultural expressions, but we don't really know what the cultural expression is. Another thing that's strange is that the geoglyphs themselves, not the lines, but the images that are in the ground, are sometimes, but are usually inconsistent with the Nazca pottery. So all the images and these mythological beings that we think must exist in the Nazca pantheon or in the Nazca consciousness, not all of them appear in geoglyphs, and some things that appear in geoglyphs are not depicted on Nazca pottery, of which there's a lot of Nazca pottery. So there's something else going on here. I'm not exactly sure what it is. Now, as far as the lines pointing in every direction imaginable, why is this? And one explanation is that when they're walking along these lines, the lines are usually pointed towards what we call wakas, which are like sacred places. They can be mountains, or they can be bodies of water or streams. I encourage you, just go on Google Earth and try to follow one of those lines. It'll go on and on and on and on and on and on and on off into the distance, and usually to nowhere in particular. There are thousands of these lines that are being marked all across and on top of each other. I don't think that the purpose of the lines is that you would start at one end and walk to the other, and that it would lead you to some kind of sacred source of water or some kind of sacred hill or sacred geological formation. I don't think that they're leading to what we call wakas, which are sacred places. I don't think that's what it is. My theory is, as I've been studying the Nazca Lines, and as I've been studying the pre-Columbian Americans in general, the reality of astronomy and the study of stars is pretty universal. It's almost everywhere, especially by about 500 BC. All across the Americas, almost everyone is an astronomer by this point. And by the time we get to 500 AD, everyone is involved in astronomy, because it's the sacred clock. You need astronomy to have a thriving civilization. And as all the civilizations get larger and larger and larger, militaries become formed, and you need food to feed the militaries. So you have to be dialed into the cosmological wheel that's spinning in the sky that tells you when the seasons are coming, so that you can plant and harvest your crops and feed your army and feed your people. It's just this momentum, this wave of civilization that moves in, that forces people to be involved in astronomy. So the Paracas people, we have of which the Nazca are descendant from, we have no evidence of significant archaeological sites like cities. What they're famous for, again, are their skulls and their textiles and their art, the woven art that they would be buried essentially within. The Paracas people may be a pre-astronomy culture that existed in their late period around 1000 BC. So it doesn't seem like astronomy has hit these people yet. They're living on the coast. They're able to fish. They have everything they need, and they're not agricultural people as much as other cultures around the Americas are. They're doing a lot of fishing, so they don't have to be tuned in to the cosmic wheel. Now, as they move down and away from the waters, and they're not fishing as much, they're still fishing a little bit in the Nazca realm, but they're also growing corn in these valleys that lead to the Nazca valleys, these valleys that go off into the Andes. So they have to be tuned in to astronomy. Now, what's the dead giveaway for this? I haven't seen this said anywhere, but as I've said all over the place on like every podcast I've ever been on, is that almost all pre-Columbian cities, it depends on how ancient they are, but almost all of them are oriented not to true north, of which the ancient pre-Columbian Americans would have been certainly aware of. They are angled slightly northeast, and this can vary. It depends on where the sun rises on the eastern horizon to these cultures, and what hemisphere they're on, and what their latitude is. But usually it's somewhere around 15 to 25 degrees northeast. Now, this coincides, like I was talking about in the last video, Secrets of the Mexican Pyramids, this coincides with the heliacal rising of the Pleiades in the night sky. And I'm not going to get overly into this. If you want to watch this, you can see the last video. But essentially, the rising of the Pleiades in the night sky as it brings the sun into the sky. It's the last constellation that appears on the northeast horizon. It symbolizes rebirth and growth. And if you align your structure to it, you will be tapped into the astronomical clock that essentially runs the ancient world. And if you can align to this and be tapped into this, you will know when the harvest is coming. You will know when it's time to plant, when the rainy season is coming. That's a whole other thing. The sacred priest city that we used to think was the capital city of the Nazca realm, Kawachi, is aligned to northeast. So the Paracas people migrate away from the Paracas Peninsula and they become the Nazca people and they adopt astronomy. So the orientation of the city itself, or of this priestly Mecca site, is telling us that the Nazca are involved in astronomy. This is something that is not widely acknowledged by South American archaeologists. I just read a book on this, and there's absolutely nothing about this in that book, and there's nothing to indicate in that book that the lines definitively have anything to do with astronomy. So the reason that I think that the Nazca lines make absolutely no sense is because I think that the Paracas people, as they evolve into the Nazca, they are trying to figure out astronomy. They see all these other people around the Andes, around the pre-Columbian world, experimenting with the stars and trying to understand them. And I think that the reason that we see so many thousands of lines, one laid on top of the other, laid on top of the other, laid on top of the other, is because the Nazca people are experimenting with what alignments to what constellations work. And they're trying to, I think they're trying to figure out the clock in the sky and see where these alignments come in. And I think that probably the vast majority of the lines are not a mistake, but a step towards fully understanding the night sky. And so some of them become irrelevant and they're carved over. And that's why the Nazca were only repairing and quote unquote sweeping some of the lines and not all of them. Also, there's evidence that the geoglyphs that depict like animals and people, these were being made in earlier periods because we can see the lines and trapezoidal formations that just cut right through them and erase them. So it's almost like at some point they move on from making the geoglyph images in the ground and they're just focused on lines. And I can't explain that. I don't know if anybody will ever be able to explain it. I think it's just a proverbial mystery. But what I think that the Nazca lines are almost certainly early ancient astronomers experimenting with the daytime and especially nighttime sky and trying to figure out the cosmic wheel that is spinning above them and why some stars spin every day, why some appear and why some disappear, and why some return to the place that they were at before. And you can imagine, you look up at the night sky and especially think about when there's no light pollution, just how many stars they may be interested in tracking. And when you're at the very precipice of learning astronomy, there's a lot to figure out there. And that's why I think that the Nazca lines don't make sense, because without a person who is an actual ancient Nazca that could speak Spanish or speak, Quechua, some ancient South American language that we can communicate with, without somebody to explain the Nazca lines to us and make sense of their process, the Nazca lines just aren't going to make sense. And that's why if anybody ever tells you that they definitively understand the true purpose of the Nazca lines, I am giving you the permission to ignore them because they're wrong. Let me know if you guys like this style of video. All I did here was I researched this video the same way that I did before, but really I just have some bullet points in front of me and I'm just going off the top of my head. I think this feels much more conversational. I'm really kind of able to get a lot of the details out that I may have not pondered on or really spent a lot of time on before. And I think it feels more casual, more like we're sitting on a podcast or having a conversation together. So for those of you that have watched it to the end, let me know what you think of this tone. I kind of like the conversational tone, and I noticed that when I'm on podcasts, people really enjoy that conversational tone, and they don't care too much if it's not highly condensed and ultra produced, if it's just more natural. I'm always going to, put the highest effort into my camera quality, my office, my set, make everything look nice. I use high resolution images. I make everything look nice, but I think that I like this conversational tone a lot. So let me know in the comment section below what you think. I'm Luke Caverns. If you want more videos on the history and mysteries of the ancient world, well, please like and subscribe for more.